Okay guys, let's have a look at what central banks do. We'll do a quick run through, brief summary of how they work, what their functions are and the tools that they use. So main functions of a central bank. First up, they print money. So the central bank is the only person or the only institution that can print money. The importance of this is that they then can control the money supply, whereas if anyone can print money, you could then end up in an inflationary situation where people just print money whenever they need it. So the central bank having control of the money printing allows them to control the money supply. They are also a regulator. Now this will take differing form depending upon the country that they're in. Certain central banks have greater regulatory powers than others. Managing FX reserves and in some cases managing the currency as a whole. This is the case with perhaps the Bank of Switzerland that used to have pegged rates. The Bank of Japan tries to manage their currency at least verbally by talking up their ability to buy more or sell more of their own currency. So central banks will aim generally to peg their currency to a dollar. Is the typical way if countries are intending on managing their foreign exchange. Now the key thing that we're looking at is monetary policy. That's where the trade opportunities are. That's where your money can be made on central banks, and that's what we're going to tackle. So that's your key focus. Let's go and have a quick look at what the aim of monetary policy is, and then also how they go about implementing monetary policy. Right, so monetary policy, what's the aim of it? Aim of monetary policy varies depending upon banks. Not banks, well, bank, but also the country that they're in. Generally, and the easiest way to sum it up is to control inflation. However, certain central banks will have differing targets for inflation and also other elements that they need to control. For example, some will have unemployment, growth, and stable prices as aims of monetary policy as well. And this varies, as I say, between central banks. Generally, it comes down to an inflation which is often a target of around about 2%. So understanding each central bank's mandate is the most important thing. Certain central banks will have a mandate that is purely inflation based in terms of, say, the ECB, whereas the Fed has a dual mandate where it is looking at stable prices and low unemployment. So understand the mandate. That will then tell you which of these numbers you need to be paying most attention to. Inflation is clearly the key factor for the European Central Bank, slightly different for other central banks. So how do they go about achieving these goals? And this all comes down to monetary policy. So monetary policy has two key areas, or traditional monetary policy does. There is either the setting of interest rates or the control of the money supply. So we're going to have a look at those in a moment. Rates come generally for many central banks in three rates, and we'll talk about how exactly these work out in a minute. And the money supply element, this is done through repo operations. And so that injects or withdraws liquidity from the system. So let's go and have a look at how exactly these work. So when you come down to interest rates, a traditional way of looking at it, or perhaps a simplistic way, is that central banks will have three key interest rates generally. There will be the refinancing rate. I'm using the terminology from the ECB here. The deposit rate, and then either a discount or marginal lending rate. So how does this all work? What you have, you have a refinancing rate which generally sits above the deposit rate. Now, the aim here is that there is no incentive for commercial banks to participate with each other outside of this boundary. Typically around about 5 basis points, so 0.5% wide. Now the reason for this being, if you're a commercial bank, you need some cash overnight. Perhaps you've got transactions that need to be fulfilled, so you need additional cash overnight. You can borrow money from the central bank via their repurchase operations, which we'll come on to. So there's no reason that you're ever going to borrow money from another bank at a rate higher, so up here, because you could go to the central bank, which is a much more credit-worthy counterparty, and so one where you're not exposing yourself to so much risk. Likewise, if you have excess funds, you can lend them to another bank, or you can deposit them at the central bank. So again, there's no reason that you would lend funds down here because of the fact that you could put these funds at the central bank, which again is a much safer counterparty. So why doesn't the rate between banks for overnight lending sit or fluctuates so wildly between this range and more likely sits reasonably close to the middle of the band? The reason for this is the central bank's influence on money supply. So how do they go about this? What the central bank serves to do is either inject money or withdraw money from the economy. So the way they go about this is via their repos, repurchase operations these are. So you have two types of repo. You have a standard repurchase operation, and you have a reverse repo. Now, the key thing to remember here is one serves to create money, whilst the other serves to destroy money, thereby managing the supply of money in the economy. So how does this work? What happens in a repo? Central bank prints money. We use euro in this example. They then buy bonds generally or high quality securities from a bank with the agreement that at some point in the future the bank will pay the money back, the central bank will hand the security back. That way, for a short period, money is created. This could be as overnight rates are starting to move up here. As they start moving higher, the central bank will conduct more repurchase operations. They will conduct them almost every day anyway, but they may conduct more repurchase operations in order to bring this overnight rate down. Now the reverse repo works in the exact opposite way. So the central bank sells securities to another bank. The commercial bank hands the money over, and this money effectively comes out of the system. It is effectively destroyed. At a time later, back it goes, and back it goes. So the money short term is destroyed. Now, what the term for this activity is this additional liquidity created in a repo is then effectively sterilised, and that's the key thing here, that the central bank is not printing new money, it's short-term creating liquidity that it then sterilises. The liquidity goes away and the economy, or the short-term rate, move back to normal. So it's all very much a short-term increasing or decreasing the money supply. Now where this all starts to change is when you then move on to extraordinary measures, which is something central banks brought in a little while later. The reason for extraordinary measures is because you've got to a situation where the refinancing rate has dropped, deposit rate has dropped almost to very similar levels, and the refinancing rate has reached around about zero. So what you've now got here is the central bank cannot reduce rates any further to stimulate the economy. The whole point of reducing rates is to help inflation stay towards that 2% target. So what do? If they're not dropping rates anymore, how can they move on to this? And this is done through extraordinary measures. Now the first and most obvious extraordinary measure is QE. The way QE works is the central bank buys bonds, and crucially these are unsterilised. Meaning that the money printed to buy the bonds doesn't then get taken out of the system again via an agreement that would happen in a repo, whereby the bonds bought would then get sold back. Unsterilised QE bond buying, the central bank will print more money, buy more bonds. Now what this serves to do is pushes up prices and it pushes down on yields. As yields go down, that therefore means borrowing costs generally are reduced, and so then serves to further reduce the cost of borrowing for banks, for the government even, because any new bonds issued would then be issued at a lower rate as well. So that's the point of QE. QE has then developed in terms of its duration, its size, and also its scope. Whereby they moved into corporate bonds. Now next up, swap lines. This was something that's done when liquidity is needed. Say for example a UK bank, so commercial bank, needs a lot of dollar funding. The Bank of England can then go to the Federal Reserve and effectively create a repo situation. There won't necessarily be a collateral switch, but it will be dollars lent short term into pounds so that funding can be carried out in the UK. So these are set up particularly in times of liquidity crunches to aid generally dollar funding, because the majority of banks will need some sort of dollar funding. One final thing after the swap lines is helicopter money. This is not something that has been done by any bank as yet, and that's why this is important to understand how helicopter money could work, because the fact that it's not previously been done, any new imposition of helicopter money could be very, very important and provide a very good trade opportunity. Now the way they could do it is either they could credit accounts of individuals, so the public would get a credit in their bank account of X amount of money. The idea behind this is by printing money, and rather than buying bonds as you would in QE, you just buy, you hand the money straight to the people who will then buy whatever they want. This theoretically increases inflation. And in a deflationary environment, this may well be seen as the best way to do so, because the fact that individuals are more likely to then spend the money given, whereas in QE the money goes to banks, which then use that to bolster their balance sheet and create a stronger looking position for themselves. The other way that helicopter money could be done is via what would be known as a zero coupon non-callable perpetual bond. So what this means is this is a bond that has zero coupon, i.e. 0% rate. It's non-callable. Therefore, if you buy the bond, you can't then ask for your money to be paid back, the principal that you paid for it. And it's perpetual, which means it does not have a maturity date, as with most bonds. For example, if you had a 10-year bond, you would know that in 10 years' time, you will get paid back the amount of the value of that bond. With a perpetual bond, there is no date, but you're also earning no yield on it either, no coupon, and you can't at any point ask for your money back either, so it's non-callable. What effectively happens here is that the central bank prints money, buys the bonds direct from the government, injecting money straight into the economy. So that's central banks in terms of what their aims are, the tools that they use to get there, and then after that, extraordinary measures that have been used in the past. Now, the announcement of any of these things is probably the single biggest impact on any market, and so understanding each of these areas, very, very important. We'll now go and have a quick look at a process for preparing for any central bank announcement.